Ravensbeck is the work of a small band of dedicated model makers who form the 7mm group within the Keighley Model Railway Club. The Black 060 goods engine is a Raven-designed P2 class. Passing on the up line, the T-Class 080 is one of the first series of 10. Only 2 of that series were outshopped in green. From these locos, it is apparent that the railway is placed within the period of pre-grouping liveries. In fact, it's the summer of 1923. Both freight trains feature delightful, outside-framed Northeastern Railway brake vans with raised lookouts for the guard. It must have been both claustrophobic and uncomfortable perched in one of these short wheelbase, poorly illuminated vans. From the local farrier to the young man train spotting, taking advantage of a horse-drawn lorry, the scene is always that of the romance of the rural railways. However, Ravensbeck is on a loop of the Northeastern Railway's main line, north to south, south of Harrogate, and features diverted and special mainline trains. Its spa hotel and other amenities make it ideal for the overspill of holidaymakers visiting Harrogate. The 242 tank was a Class A, later LNER F8, number 1603, designed by Worsdale. The clerestory vehicle is an ex-Stockton and Darlington family saloon with a non-clerestory third-class compartment for servants. Railway workers are provided with housing by the company in the station approach road. At the end of the terrace outside the local shop, the shopkeeper sweeps the dirt from the pavement and chats to one of the locals who may well be giving birth to a railway worker of the next generation before long. 864 is a Class B Wilson-Worsdale tank engine similar to the Class A goods engine that had smaller wheels. A few of these 062 tanks were fitted with Westinghouse brake for passenger duties. Well, you can't please everybody. In 1903, the NER produced diesel-electric rail cars that were given the title electric, perhaps to give an impression of modernism. From the detailed interior, it can be seen that, as with other companies' rail cars and auto coaches, they were not too concerned about passenger comfort. The 2 units built had a checkered history, being withdrawn in 1931. Originally underpowered, they were later fitted with second-hand battle tank engines. Generally confined to the Scarborough area, they were a useful asset in LNER days to the Cawood, Whistow and Selby Light Railway, forestalling an early visit to the scrapyard. The model features 1371 as built. High above the portals of the mainline tunnel and that of the Broughton branch, a farmer idly tends his sheep, and a farm worker pauses on his descent with horse and cart on seeing the crossing gates closed. The train is the local goods headed by an 060 tank number 1792, later Class J71 in the LNER days. The J72, an example of which can be seen preserved on the North Yorkshire Moors Railway, looked similar but had smaller wheels. Stopping at Ravensbeck, she brings general merchandise and coal for the local coal depot. As she runs to a halt in the station, we see again the slotted post gantry signals that control the exit from the station and entry to the yard. Diverted from the main line, a heavy passenger train rattles the windows of the line-side buildings as she heads north. Control of the station area, with its plethora of signals, some companies seem to need more than others, is from high in the main box, cantilevered out over both running lines and goods yard. The box is based on one at Fence Houses, and like other buildings has a fully modelled interior with lighting. All the prototypical point rodding, cranks and walkways are carefully modelled to give a fine impression of the railway scene in the early 20s. Notice the distinctive northeastern bracket signal with tall finials. The slotted post signals that could be jammed by heavy falls of snow or ice were frowned upon by the Board of Trade, but a few survived internationalization despite their dangers. In the foreground are two snowplows, hinting that it's not always warm and sunny in the Yorkshire Dales. The local goods is engaged in replacing the empty hoppers on the coal drops, or stays, with the loaded wagons. Ravensbeck derives its name from the small stream or brook, the local term being beck. By no coincidence, Raven happens to be the name of a former North Eastern Railway chief mechanical engineer, Sir Vincent Raven. The coal depot has decoratively cut slates for roofing. These contrast with the local handmade pantiles of the old farmhouse and stables, now dominated by the embankment of the railway. The farm buildings, like most others, are based on careful observation of prototypes in the northeast and are reduced in size or turned about as required. By working from prototype buildings that look as though they belong in the landscape, a happy outcome is achieved. Pausing on the crossing at Broughton Junction, a platelayer watches as a small boilered 060 J21 climbs north into the tunnel. A large Raven 444 tank rushes out of the tunnel with a mixed selection of carriage stock, including carriage truck, parcels van, covered van, and a vehicle in beautiful LNWR livery. Almost peculiar to the northeast, 444 tanks were not popular with British engineers. Classified D by the Northeastern, they became H1s on the LNER, where they were rebuilt to 462 tanks by Gresley in the 1930s. Worsdale Class V Atlantic, number 1792, brings another mainline diversion to an unscheduled stop at Ravensbeck, and an opportunity for the locals to observe the splendour in which the more privileged members of society could afford to travel. 1792 was built at Gateshead in 1904, one of only two to pass into British Railways' hands. She is fitted with Westinghouse brakes and kept in immaculate condition by her shed staff. She is painted in the standard northeastern Saxon green, with small coat of arms on the rear splasher and larger version on the tender. The Pullmans are an anachronism, being 1925 stock in early livery, but who would quibble about 2 years to see such a magnificent rake of coaches? On the platform are the milk churns that adorned nearly every platform in the heyday of railways. Behind in the bay is a purpose-built van with ventilated sides, specifically for carrying milk churns. In the next siding, a twin-tanked wagon held a supply of low-pressure coal gas. 1728, Northeastern Class E, later J71, on shunting duties, emerges from the three-arch road bridge, passing the inspection saloon that has been simmering in the siding for some hours now. The passing permanent way train consists of a mere ballast hopper and a brake van. A sister J71 engine is in charge. Through the passenger entrance to Ravensbeck, we see one of the pair of coaches that, together with 044 Tank 591, makes up a push-pull set. The station master's house and station buildings are based on those at Nunthorpe, Cleveland, but they are back to front. In the yard, a charabanc waits to take guests up to the Spa Hotel. Number 591 was one of the earliest bogie tank passenger, or BTP class, built in 1874 by Nielsen & Co. She was a well tank, that is, she had additional water capacity in tanks low down between her frames. The three stone arches lead onto the main span of the viaduct that is built from box section girders and decorated with a cast iron parapet. Beneath the viaduct, workmen labour in a damp trench, while the local landowner takes his pleasure in the cold waters of the Ravensbeck, fly fishing. The smaller ornamental bridge leads up to the Spa Hotel. Out of sight is one of the first tees of the local golf course that brings other sportsmen to Ravensbeck. Crossing the Ravensbeck is an M-Class 440 piloting the Atlantic formerly seen on the Pullman train. The M-Class once held the Darlington-York speed record. The lighter-coloured teak carriage from the East Coast joint stock has a distinctive bowstring underframe. The final two vehicles are covered carriage trucks. We return to the yard, where the loaded coal hoppers are now taken from the short head shunt and propelled onto the coal drops. There are 3 drops corresponding to the 3 wagons that discharge between the rails into further hoppers. These then in turn discharge the coal via chutes, with sliding shutters, onto the ground where it is bagged for domestic use or into carts to be taken away for industrial purposes. The brickwork of the structure, the retaining wall and coal office are decorated with stone quoins. A mixture of brick and stone can make quite mundane buildings attractive. The line also sees through workings from the Midland Railway. As a down train of Midland stock headed by a northeastern engine passes, a local Midland train headed by a Kirtley 240 pauses at the station. The long-lived class of 1P outside-framed passenger engines were originally the Midland's frontline express engines, but by this time were downgraded to local workings such as this. The 2 coaches are numbered 597 and 675, and the engine 216. The local pickup goods has now collected its brake van from the head shunt, a couple of vans, the empty gas tank and coal hoppers, and has been given the right-of-way out of the yard onto the main running line to continue to the next station where delivery or collection is required. Due to the variable nature of such duties, when little work was involved, it was a very leisurely process. The pace of life at many country stations allowed staff to indulge in other activities, of which gardening was a favourite. Crossing the viaduct with an up-mixed of passenger stock and cattle vans is another of the standard goods engines, which later became LNER J21. This one differing from the black example at Broughton Junction by virtue of its extended smoke box and green passenger livery. As was common with the archetypal British 060 goods, the Northeastern's version was not confined to freight working. The train it's hauling is headed by an 1870s 4-wheel passenger brake van with birdcage roof. These vehicles lasted longer than their passenger equivalents in many cases, and during the First World War were frequently seen in use as luggage vans in the same rakes as the latest bogie passenger stock. Behind the brake is a 4-wheel milk van with slatted side, followed by a carriage truck and then 2 horse boxes. The prototypes of 2 of the last coaches in the train were sold to the North Sunderland Railway and remained in use until the 1950s. A Worsdale Class M 440 heads south through the station with through Midland stock, the coaches being characteristic Clayton-designed clerestories. The station master, who was a pillar of society, is provided with a pleasant house by today's standards. He or his wife is a keen gardener. As a short train of coal hoppers passes, heading for Adventure Colliery, the starter comes off, indicating the imminent approach of a down train. Porthole windows in the carriage end indicate it is the end of a northeastern push-pull. Somewhat incongruous in a railway carriage, they afford little better vision than from many tank engines. From his driving end, the driver only controlled the brake and regulator, often not very satisfactorily. Marshalling the engine anywhere but at the head of the train must have made picking up water inconvenient. As this last train passes out of picture, we extend our thanks to the members of the Keighley 7 Mill Group for the pleasure of being allowed to record their railway.
Here we show the body construction of a loco and tender for a DJH kit. In order to make a model of anything, familiarity with the prototype will be a great advantage. On the mid-hants we see BR Class 260 76017. Reasonable general arrangement drawings have been published for all BR standard classes with photographs. So with the kit manufacturer's instructions a start can be made. Here we will attempt to build the kit without resorting to scratch building. It consists, as many kits do today, of a combination of etched brass components and white metal castings. The silvered etched parts are plated, although many manufacturers use nickel silver for valve gear and frames. Naturally, all castings are made from moulds and will have flash where the moulds join depending on the age of the moulds, etc. An ugly seam on a boiler, this is fortunately a one-part boiler, will ruin the model. To limit damage to rivet detail and boiler bands, the initial cleaning up is done by scraping carefully with a scalpel. This is followed by sanding with a blank file, or an old file will do, covered with a strip cut from self-adhesive sanding disc. White metal is difficult to file as the file will clog easily. A fiberglass eraser, available from graphic shops and model shops, is an invaluable tool for polishing white metal without damaging detail. The boiler and firebox do not fit well, as not all patterns were produced specifically for this type of engine to keep costs low. Ill-fitting components are a general rule in model kits, unfortunately, although happily there are exceptions. Edges to the footplate are often damaged, but here the simple BR form can be easily cleaned up. Where the footplate overhangs the valance, more ingenuity is required. Effectively rebates, as here where the buffer beam fits, can be cleaned up using a sharp bevel chisel. It is really not practical to remove a sharp rebate with a file. Broken files can be ground down to produce useful scrapers though. Very few tools are required, but a pin vise is an essential. Ensure that the boiler sits square, it's also an essential. Drilling by hand requires patience and can be hard on the fingers, but is often safer than an electric mini drill. All other parts are attached to the boiler firebox and footplate assembly. Low melt solder and a temperature controlled iron transfer solder to tinned parts. Before any soldering operation, liberal amounts of flux should be applied. Flux must be used before and during all soldering, in this case low melt white metal flux. Although clumsy, the 65-watt iron gives plenty of heat at low temperature to quickly heat the large masses of white metal. The soft white metal footplate is easily bent, so check all is well before assembly. The awkwardness of a large iron is demonstrated here. A smaller temperature-controlled iron would be useful, as it could get inside the boiler and other awkward places. It is always preferable to solder from the inside, and for this reason, although not apparent, the smoke box door was not fitted until all the boiler detail, handrails, etc. had been fitted. The smoke box door was in fact the only part to be added with superglue. The application of solder to a clean fluxed surface is simple, assuming adequate quantities of heat. The big advantage over superglue is that parts can be easily removed. The chimney and dome must be exactly top dead centre, not an easy task in the time it takes for superglue to cure. Etched brass is far superior in representing sheet metal than cast material. I was unconvinced that the development of the cab was correct. It is often easier to part half-etch folds and reassemble the parts. Etched and cast parts rarely fit perfectly, so some work will be required to ensure they do. Here it's not initially possible to fit the cab front against the firebox. The inside of the cab front is tinned with normal temperature solder prior to fitting. Brass should be tinned with normal solder, then low melt for a brass to white metal combination. Check again that the cab front is square to all other components. Being a little way out with major items will destroy the character of the prototype that we're trying to capture. In practice, the cab side was better than this, but had it been still attached to the front, it would have been impossible. As can be seen, a large gap exists between the cab side and floor, and this can be filled with solder to space it out and attach it. Solder used carefully is a good filler of joints. It cannot be stressed too heavily that it is not being at high enough a temperature that causes most problems. The solder should flow or run into corners and between surfaces. Small low-watt irons, for me at least, always make things difficult. The cab roof required a lot of fitting. The sides and front have rivet detail that must be retained. Chiselling the white metal was resorted to. The sharper the tool, the less likely it is that you will remove wanted metal or fingers, so take care. Surplus material was removed from the sides with a 6-inch file. A wire brush for cleaning the file will be useful. With the folded up floor in place, the back of the firebox, totally incorrect for this class of engine, was located. A bought-in replacement part is strongly recommended. Assembly of ill-fitting parts takes 10 times the time of well-fitting ones, but with patience a good approximation of the prototype can be achieved. The cab roof must be horizontal, as any discrepancy in the horizontal will stand out. A piece of self-adhesive sanding disc stuck to a sheet of chipboard is most useful for cleaning up etched parts such as these. With laminations or overlays, tin both parts and bring them together and apply heat. The working surface of some faced chipboard is particularly heat resistant to work on. Construction of sub-assemblies is invariably easier than attaching parts to the whole, as they are easier to get at and hold. Another important step is cleaning off all traces of flux by scrubbing with mild abrasive in warm water. As a brake, I assembled an X-Acto scale screw coupling for the front buffer. The extremely well made parts are straightforward to assemble and have a very good instruction sheet. A small shallow hole in the working surface will hold the bob weight while the sleeve is butted to it. To open up the holes, a jeweller's cutting broach is used that replaces expensive and easily broken drills. These broaches are available from some model shops and suppliers of specialist tools. It is quite simple to squeeze the links over the shackles. The finished couplings are probably the best on the market. Many types of excellent brass chimneys are available, but the white metal one supplied is particularly good, but beware of damaging it. Being solid is its only drawback, so with a cordless drill and a round file it was opened up. Be careful drilling white metal though, as the drill can easily bind. For this reason the final opening up was done by hand. We have deliberately avoided adding or modifying the kit to any great extent, but the smokebox door is again such a characteristic feature of a locomotive that we couldn't resist some additions. The smokebox door dart handles were removed and replaced with a pair of modified handrail knobs, but these can be bought in. The handrail knobs, as mentioned before, are a detail that is more easily added at this stage. Surprisingly, there are no lamp irons in the kit. Again, these can be bought as etchings or made up from stripped brass and added at this stage. On the front of the footplate I added a couple of grab handles. The steps provided are a little dubious, with identification letters etched just where they're not required. New steps from scraps of stripped brass are easily bent up. Holding the brass to be bent against a file gives a sharp bend. The steps are attached to a piece of wire that locates in holes drilled in the front footplate. The water feed clack valves were perhaps the worst small casting and required a lot of work to get them to stand upright. They are in fact attached to a wire passing horizontally through the boiler. Here we see tender sub-assemblies with detail added. In a kit of all brass parts, these can be finally assembled using low temperature solder. Adding details with low melt solder can be an advantage if they are to a large heat sink such as a solid brass smoke box. The characteristic combination of loco cab and tender front lacks the angle iron flange that is apparent in views of the engine. Always beware of the iron getting too hot for low melt. The first signs are that the solder becomes stiff and sludgy as it picks up white metal. Don't think it's too cool necessarily if this happens. The tender steps are a simple fold-up etch bearing little resemblance to the prototype. I drilled out the sides to accept wire rungs. Cutting out the rungs but leaving two to hold the sides together allowed the wire rungs to be added. The spacing was too wide, so the remaining rungs were removed and the sides eased together. Etched brass components can be cut out in a number of ways. The safest, in order to avoid bending any components, is to use a wood chisel on a brass block. If only assembly was this easy.
Blaenycwm is in an eastern valley on the extreme easterly extent of the South Wales coalfield. Its railway is GWR, although the London North Western, now part of the LMS, had running powers to the colliery. The first train of the day is seen emerging from the tunnel that leads down the valley. Its short four-wheeled stock in maroon livery identifies it as a workers' train. The stock is formed of downgraded classes that formerly would have served both the rural and suburban railway. Often, former six-wheel carriages were converted to four-wheel types. The steeply graded railways of South Wales are rarely modelled, and it was the challenge of building such a line that gave this layout impetus. Blaenycwm, which translated means head of the valley, although fictitious, is carefully placed historically and geographically within the railway network. The colliery own a Kerr Stewart 060 side tank. Similar engines were supplied to the Brecon and Merthyr, Alexandra Docks and the Tirpentois colliery near Pontypool. The engine is kept busy working the wagons under the screens where the coal is graded prior to loading. The majority of railways in South Wales owed little of their origins to the GWR. Of the early lines, only the South Wales Railway was worked by the GWR. The Vale of Neath, another broad gauge line, was independent, as were the other railways. Most lines came into the GWR fold only at the grouping when their engines were westernised. Empty wagons arriving at the colliery are pulled up the steep gradient easily but noisily by the powerful Churchwood 280 tank. These were some of the most powerful GWR locos. With an extended bunker and an extra pair of carrying wheels, they could cover the longer distances out of South Wales to the Midlands and London. Most coal was for export through the many and large South Wales ports. The signal box, like so many things GWR, is of standardized construction. Like their engines, there were detail changes over the years, but they always appear distinctly GWR. Railway companies usually had distinctive designs of signal box, and the GWR were not providers of a bracketed walkway enabling easy window cleaning. In South Wales, the valleys run from north to south in relative isolation from one another. They were connected in the south by various lines, and in the north by the head of the valleys lines, connecting with the industrial Midlands of England. It is quite apparent that the railway is built on substantial gradients. That for the passenger line into the station is 1 in 30, but looks steeper, as the goods line is 1 in 24 as it climbs into the reception sidings. The 280 backs its train into one of the 4 sidings. These 4 sidings can be used for either full or empty stock. They hold trains of 12 wagons. Shunting involves dropping off the brake van while the passenger engine is busy negotiating point work to gain access to the engine shed. In the station forecourt, a bus awaits the first normal service passenger train. The train is hauled by a 5600 062 tank, number 5605. It is hauling 3 clear-story carriages in the fully lined-out brown and cream livery. This handsome scheme was dropped with the advent of flush-panelled stock. The painting of panelled stock in a simple 2-colour livery made them look shabby. The origins of Blaenycwm are somewhat obscure. Its goods shed is of a design used by the Monmouth Railway and Canal Company. The station building is GWR turn of the century, so it must have been long a part of the GWR. The valleys were synonymous with tank engines. Blaenycwm having no turntable, bunker first working was the norm. Of necessity, it is not a practice to be encouraged, as the driver and fireman both have their backs to signals when attending to the engine. The passenger engine runs around its train and prepares for the first departure from Blaenycwm down the valley for connections with the South Wales main line. The 280 tank that brought in the empties, having taken on water, now moves up to couple to the rake of loaded wagons prepared by the Kerr-Stewart colliery engine. Looking along the line of the river, we see the small foundry with its tall chimney. Outside is a crane formed from a large tripod of wooden legs with jib attached. On the right, the wooden engine shed with brick-built offices and workshops has stood there since the opening of the line. Surprisingly, wooden sheds, built initially for economy, lasted throughout the life of the steam engine without alteration or incineration. The rake of private owner wagons, note the absence of any railway company wagons, is followed by a toad. The telegraphic codes for certain vehicles, such as this brake van, are now in common parlance with GWR enthusiasts. At the opposite extreme to the quiet rural setting of the typical GWR branch line terminus is the industry of coal extraction. The screens are housed in a steel-framed structure with brick infill. It contrasts sharply with the other stone buildings. A very typical colliery feature, it is based on a larger screen that stood at South Kellannin Colliery in the Western Valleys. Beneath the screens, in the brick-lined cutting, a train negotiates the scissors crossing. The private owner wagons have been carefully researched to be appropriate for Blaenycwm. For many, the study of private owner wagons is an end in itself. Although coal wagon design varied little within railway clearinghouse specifications, examples from a wide age range with a variety of liveries were always apparent. Ability to produce hand-painted accurate liveries such as these adds greatly to authenticity. Coal is brought to the surface in small four-wheeled wagons known as drams. As is quite common with railway unloading systems, the wagons work on a gravity-assisted route, circular here. The lower levels of the narrow gauge connects with the standard gauge to transport the imported materials for the workshops. The mine itself requiring pit props and gunpowder as well as labour. The slag heaps are encroaching on one of the few magnificent trees that survive, along with sheep that wander oblivious to the danger of the railway. The gunpowder van, with its distinctive red diagonal cross on the door, is a covered iron van known by the telegraphic code as a mink, thus the term iron mink. These vans were lined with lead, and a pair of special nail-less boots hung up inside the doors to be worn when working inside the van to further reduce the possibility of sparks igniting the explosives. The scene is dominated by the head frame. Built from timber, as early examples were, it stands some 50 feet tall. Basically a wooden trestle, it carries the wheels, known as sheaves, that carry the cables attached to the cages or lifts that descend and ascend the pit shaft. Notice the creeper connecting the pit head level of these narrow gauge workings with the lower level where arrivals of gunpowder and pit props are dealt with. In the shadow of the 16-foot sheave, or winding wheel, the shunting tank runs into its shed for water, as yet another train of empties arrives. This train is headed by an 080 goods engine in LMS livery, but was formerly an LNWR loco. Finally, thanks to the North Gwent Railway modelers who allowed us to film their railway, and for making it an enjoyable occasion.
I use the matte Humbrol paints mixed to a colour that suits the idea of how the prototype might have looked, in this case in the 1870s. The technique is that of dry brushing, that is, with the absolute minimum amount of paint on the brush, just about to go off. A piece of plastic squeezes the surplus paint out after mixing. I always start on a piece of scrap or the building where it is likely to be out of sight underground. A variety of mortar colours applied first and allowed to dry are given the same brick colour. These will change the perceived brick colour, especially as the mortar is over scale. A grey that's too blue, as here, will give a purple colour to the overall appearance. It is possible to utilise the basic colour of the plastic, but I've not tried it on a substantial structure. It would be necessary to paint the bricks in the window and door reveals, though. Perhaps this technique of scraping of the brick colour and highlighting a few bricks might work. It's always worth keeping an open mind and trying new ideas. In this general view, note that as the mortar colour was applied, a little dirt colour was added to the areas under the window sills and up from the ground. Think about changes in colour for new brickwork, in repairs, blocked up windows and doors, etc. The rule is to work diagonally away from obstacles with a dry brush. Vary the colour slightly as you go along. North-facing walls have more dirt, lichens, dirtier mortar, etc. A number of coats will build up the colour, so be patient. Too much paint will fill the mortar, but this can be scraped out and retouched. The occasional underpainted brick can be covered when adding random bricks of a different colour. Picking out the different colours of the bricks does not have to be very precise, and painting all of them in a variety of colours will produce a very pleasing effect. Not all buildings were so attractive. Machine-pressed bricks can be monotonously precise in texture and colour. The brickwork is often stained by rainwater pipes and the damp of water splashing from adjacent roofs. It is important to go out and observe carefully appropriate buildings in different light and times of year. Unlike painting the prototype, everything has to be painted as it starts off white. Pay particular care to the underside of the bottom row of slates and the backs of gutters. They always show up later. The best exercise is to look at the building in bright sunlight, as it highlights those missed patches. I prefer the Humbrol paints because for the most part they cover in one coat and speed up the process. 10 or so very dilute coats can produce almost as good a finish as an airbrush. The only surface where this finish is likely to benefit is the doors. I've a colour in my mind as to slates, but I can always look out upon slate-roofed buildings. As with brickwork, a little brown seems necessary. Slate colour of course varies widely, but avoid the purples and greens unless you are aware of their appropriateness. Here I find it best to ensure enough paint is mixed to paint the whole roof, as slates are pretty uniform in colour. For some ridge tiles, a hint of semi-gloss can just highlight the coarse glaze, otherwise all surfaces are decidedly matte. 1 or 2 slates of a slightly different shade will improve the appearance, although there may be none in real life. Where birds take off, their droppings provide food for the growth of lichens along the edges of the roofs, below chimneys, cables, television aerials, etc. An old battered brush, almost dry, applies a little yellow to represent lichens. Here the flashings are of cement, but carefully prepared and painted lead flashings bring life to roofscapes. To the windows. As it's the 1870s, brown seemed appropriate. It's always easy to leave them white as they look clean and crisp. Painting the glazing bars first. Here I'm using a small brush, but I've also done so with a mapping pen, open to run along the corner of the glazing bars. Turn the building through 90 degrees and successively paint the exposed accessible surfaces. Generally treat the woodwork and guttering as you would the prototype. For doors, paint the panels, the middle, top and bottom rails, and then the stiles. A final view reveals that it would have been wise to include curtains, but otherwise it's quite satisfactory. It's always been a bit of a puzzle just why there is a proud string course on only two sides of the chimney. I've noticed other buildings in the locality that are similar. Any suggestions? All it needs now is a hole in the ground to settle into, and some surrounding scenery, not to mention a railway and crossing gates.
Adventure Colliery exploits coal measures in the Yorkshire Dales above Ravensbeck, and the model is primarily the work of an individual member of the Ravensbeck group. The empty hopper wagons have just made their way from Ravensbeck via Broughton Junction, named after the station halt that serves the small mining community adjacent to the colliery. The branch line engine is a Northeastern 060 tank, number 407, one of the H2 class, some of which were built as crane tanks. 407 features higher side tanks than standard. Above her, as she runs round her train, are the lattice girders that support the signal box. Placing signal boxes in such a manner was common northeastern practice. Behind the coal hoppers, we can just see the entrance to the single-tunnel drift mine. Drift mines were those not requiring shafts, as the coal outcrops naturally on a hillside. The raised water tank, utilising an old boiler, is a frequently observed feature of the Northeastern Railway, here serving the engine's stabling line. From the colliery manager's first-floor office, he can observe all trains and the above-ground workings of the colliery. In the foreground is the colliery-owned Hudswell Clark 040 saddle tank, and behind, the complex of industrial buildings, boiler house, workshops, etc. The all-seeing colliery manager is somewhat perplexed by the behaviour of the nurse. Oh well, it must be in the interests of efficiency. The Northeastern engine is a beautifully lined-out H-class number 1310. Notice the generous cab and coal placed on the side tanks. As she shuffles forward, we can see the point rodding running down from the lever frame and the small double coal drop. The coal depot is not associated with the mine. The depot was often an extra source of income for the station master, with the railway company management maintaining a vigilant eye. The diminutive 040 is about to push the empties beneath the screens for loading. In the background can be seen the rope-worked incline that takes the small narrow-gauge coal wagons that have run out of the mine up to the level of the screens. There are both 10 and 20-ton coal hoppers. Inside the 10-ton wagon, the sloping floor can just be made out. Apparently, Adventure Colliery owns no wagons of its own, as these sport two styles of northeastern lettering. The colliery reflects the interests of the group member with a long career in the coal industry. The carefully observed buildings have that look of solid, functional civil engineering. Coal discharged from the narrow gauge system is loaded onto a conveyor that takes it up in the screens where it is washed and graded into different sizes. Fortunately, unrepaired damage to the roof enables us to see the graded coal on a second conveyor being loaded into the 20-ton four-wheel hopper. Just up the line from the colliery is Broughton Halt. It is served by a forerunner of today's sprinters, yes, a Leyland rail bus. Powered by a four-cylinder 35-horsepower engine, it was converted for rail use by the addition of an extra driving compartment. As a result of overheating, a second radiator was added for reverse working. This pleasant wooden shelter is in the process of being repainted. The Halt even has limited goods facilities, and a Lancashire and Yorkshire Railway van sits in the passing loop, as does the labourer. Finally, the rail bus accelerates away down the line to Ravensbeck.
We pick up Project N with the track laid and in theory the wiring complete. There should be little requirement to solder above the baseboard at this stage. Quite simply, the whole landscape is piled high with layers of expanded polystyrene. This can be bought at DIY stores and is not expensive, for example Homebase. It is cut with a kitchen knife on a base of old carpet. A long straight edge is useful. PVA glue holds it in place, and to be economical, all the scraps and offcuts go into the lower levels that need not be solid. Once the PVA has gone off, the talents of a sculptor can be discovered. Generally, avoid any dramatic changes in curvature. Take a look at an aerial photograph of almost any part of the British landscape. Notice how gently rounded even some of the dramatic features are. There will be gentle ridges and steps. If you attempt to give the whole a smooth, gently undulating surface, from eye level, it will look almost right. The embankments are really too steep. A gradient of 1 to 1.5 is the steepest. To my surprise, sanding in one direction at a time will produce a good surface to the carved polystyrene. The riverbed is the lowest point, down to the baseboard. The abandoned railway could have been entirely polystyrene. Using polystyrene, it's possible to add and subtract features almost at will. The polystyrene is covered with texture coat. This is a DIY product that gives a textured, flexible coating. It also has the ability to fill cracks and holes. It's slow drying, so thick areas and deep holes will take days to go off. I applied it with a spreader. Before it dries, it tends to be self-levelling, but unless it's required to be rough, get it as smooth as possible. It keys well to the polystyrene and produces a remarkably tough, slightly springy surface. I can see no drawbacks in this scale. In the larger scales, there would be nothing very positive, however, to locate telegraph poles, etc. I tried dyeing the texture, but settled for spraying it matte earth, as it takes the gloss off it. Matte emulsion would have been cheaper. Bear in mind the underlying colour required, for example chalk cuttings, red Devon soil, etc. The scenic material is held in place with PVA, diluted with water and added washing up liquid. A variety of scatter products were used. They are generally wood fibres or polystyrene foam. Avoid the former. Once a base layer is applied, it is thoroughly saturated with a spray of water and added detergent. Further patches of different textures and colours are added. Bear in mind that embankments particularly are knee-deep in grasses, wild plants, small bushes, etc. So a base that's 3 mm deep is quite reasonable, if a little expensive. As this is not intensively farmed, I wanted scrubby, overgrown hedges that would also conceal joints in the baseboards and lift out sections. The readily available lichens were cut up, as most is useless for 2 mm scale. They form the base for hedges and bushes. Layer upon layer of scenic products were used to build up the surface. I found Hubert Carr's material useful. Something akin to the inside of a full Hoover bag was widely used. The whole is bound together with copious quantities of PVA, sprayed of course to allow it to penetrate everywhere. It would seem there are few quality line-side extras available in 2mm, ratio being a notable exception. Their fencing requires toning down to a light matte grey. It is flexible and strong and can be distorted viciously to make it follow the contours of the land. A small slit in the texture coat land surface will allow fence posts to be pushed in. No gluing was necessary. Remember to leave gaps in the fencing, as baseboard or other joints can be filled with bushes. The best tops of the lichen can be cut off and cut in two, then glued either side of the fencing. Project N would benefit from 500 or so trees. These simple copper wire trees are produced by dividing multi-strand wire in three, then three again, and so on. This takes about 20 minutes per tree. Any offers to construct them? By spraying with spray mount, an aerosol adhesive, and dipping in one of the coarser foam materials, foliage for a potential forest was produced. Project N features a variety of bridges. You might think they were built first, but they were not. It would have been easier, but the object is that it should be enjoyable. Therefore, do whatever you like. Don't be a slave to any convention, is my philosophy. It's a hobby, not a race against time. Four wing walls from the usual embossed sheet with a 1mm backing were produced. They have a capping added. The curve is easily produced by bending. Hold it for several hours while the solvent goes off. The short bridge section is fabricated from plasticard with formers to hold the arch. The arch is slotted under the track that has had its plywood base thinned. Large voids are filled with blocks of polystyrene. Now to my other favourite cheap material, ordinary plaster. This is mixed to a consistency that is just stiffer than runny. Don't worry about getting it on the plasticard, as it scrapes off without any problem. Keep an eye on it, because as it begins to harden, a smooth surface for roads, etc. can be produced with a plasticard filling knife. The next bridge is to be a small girder bridge. Simple abutments from 40 thou plasticard and embossed sheet were made. Cutting is done with a hard-backed razor blade, although other tools can be used. Always use a square and straight edge. After a light cut, it can be easily broken. The back of the stone embossed plasticard is uneven. A little scraping will ensure that the surfaces come together for the solvent to make a sound joint. The excess sheet is cut away carefully we see the bonding extended through the exposed edges of the sheet and then cleaned up by scraping and wire brushing. Although a gap had been left for the bridge, it would have been a simple matter to install an occupation bridge into an embankment at almost any location. The abutments are placed in roughly in order to make an estimate of the size and shape for the wing walls. All four of the same proportion. Generally the slope will be in round figures of 1 in 1, 1.5 in 1, 2 in 1, etc., depending on the nature of the soil used to build the embankment. The wing walls will probably receive end pillars when time permits. They are made up in the usual way. Making up two 3-panelled girders that are formed of sheet steel and T and L irons is a useful exercise. If you can achieve this, you are halfway to scratch building a variety of structures and wagons. The panels from 20 thou, 10 would be better but more vulnerable to damage, are marked out as a pair and made up as a pair. The centre sections of the T-irons are fixed first, then the side pieces. In larger scales these can include embossed rivet detail. The outer angle is added around the whole sheet and the inner side of the angle placed inside around the edge. Only one side was treated as the rail side is not very visible. A track base is added, and at the same time the road was realigned by removing some of the scenery. This was covered with plaster and the girders positioned and fixed in place with solvent. In another programme we will build a simple arched viaduct to finish this corner. It's on both a curve and a gradient, typical of the problems facing the model maker who compresses the landscape. We now look at the platforms. Basically, two 40 thou or 1 mil side pieces for the platform face are spaced by transverse members. Externally the faces are covered with stone embossed sheet. Coping or edging from strip on the top surface is finally finished with a sheet material, as we shall see. The platform faces are spaced from the track with a strip against the sleeper ends on the cork underlay. Ensure that trains can pass with adequate clearance, but the minimum necessary. The end ramps usually run away slightly from the running lines. Cut and place the transverse pieces carefully, ensuring the platform face is vertical and curves gently with the running lines. Transfer the curve of the platform onto the undersurface of the platform as shown. A small plane is ideal for producing the subtle curve. Support the sheet while planing. This base was added and the top of the embossed sheet removed with a plane. A little sanding block is very useful. An edging strip was part of the scribed sheet used in the crossing keeper's house. The coping stones could have extended beyond the platform face, but did not so here. When working across the baseboard joints, remember to cut through the platform as it is built. The space between the coping slabs was filled with sheet material. I contemplated doing so with plaster, but it would have been too thin. Sand the top surface down. For variety, the non-railway side was finished with stonework as though the walls were the edging. The yard required dirty ballast without any sign of stones, more a bare earth of dust and dirt. Onto a base of PVA, plaster was spread dry and then thoroughly wetted. It will absorb large quantities of water and the usual detergent for good measure. The idea was that it should be very strong, adhere well, and hold the track in place once set. When a suitable consistency, it can be smoothed with a spreader or miniature float. Again, bearing in mind the scale, the smoother the better. A few stones can be pressed in to add a little texture. Track ballast was a difficult problem, not fully solved here. I used fine white sand, not builder's sand, but sand collected from a walk in the New Forest. An infinite amount of time can be spent getting it into the correct level by spreading and brushing. It looks very white, but it's far easier to darken it later than lighten it, as spraying the track has more effect on the sleepers than the ballast, and you will end up with sleepers lighter than the ballast. Note, of course, that ballast colour varies across the country. It's then thoroughly wetted with water and detergent, PVA, and then more water and detergent. Ideally, it ends up like concrete. Further applications of PVA and water may be necessary. A wire brush will take excess off the sleepers and rails, and then vacuum fastidiously. A note of warning: unless you're very careful, the reliability of the points will be jeopardized. Leave the area around the switch blades unballasted and around the tie bar slide. Also protect them from water, detergent and PVA.
Sterndale has taken Donald Avery 2 years to build. It's a creditable first layout constructed in N-gauge and ably demonstrates how the average enthusiast can pack a working railway and immense detail into just 5 feet by 3 feet. It is surprisingly compact, with plenty to view and evidence of attention to detail. Innovation too has played its part in establishing the final effect. The layout has a 5 feet by 3 feet frame and insulation board base. The buildings are either freelance or adapted kits. The rolling stock likewise. The track work is by Minitrix. Sterndale is set in the Peak District, and behind the scenes a fiddle siding arrangement copes with a capacity for 2 mainline trains and other associated operations. Sterndale is controlled by Donald Avery's own design of controller with contact and capacity discharge. An auto train off the branch regularly works into Sterndale town to connect with the main line. The 262 tank operates push-pull and comprises of loco and modified Farish suburban stock. Controlling the crossover to the branch, a Fulgurex colour light signal with route indicator modifications. No Peak District model would seem complete if it did not have its own quarry and mineral line. Sterndale is no exception. A short line from the main station winds into the hills and to the quarry. The buildings and loading arrangements here are built from a modified dock crane. The mineral line is delightfully set out, with its own Minitrix dock tank, the guard's van is permanently coupled, and with Farish wheels and pickups prevents adverse stalling. Back in Sterndale Station Yard, the station's diesel motive power utilises the same ploy. It's worth taking a few moments to absorb some of the finer detail in the central scenic area of the model. Whilst the pub's exterior sign is made from a postage stamp, most of the scenics are by Woodland. The pig orchard enjoys a tree collection made from flex, solder and paint. Sterndale's attraction is that it combines an interesting scenic and operational detail in a very compact 5 feet by 3 feet form and disproves the theory that you can't get a quart into a pint pot.